Hello, I'm Cole Powell, award-winning singer-songwriter from Random Mind Records. If you enjoy what you hear, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, click the bell for notifications. Consider supporting us on Patreon for exclusive perks, including polls and long-form reactions. Also, be sure to check out our brand new arts and media podcast, Words Like That, hosted by me, wherever you get your podcasts. All right, now I'll shut up and get to it.
Can't handle words like that. Words like that. No, no, no.
I went to see Dune Part 2 this past weekend. And I did a trailer reaction to that on the channel. You can go check that out. I thought it looked really good. I love the first one. I wrote a review for that you can find on my website, colepowell.net. I wrote that review, published that when the film first came out, Part 1. And I went to see it with a good friend of mine, Zach Farnham. He's been my drummer for years. He's a pop culture expert. We saw it, and we actually came back and had an in-depth discussion on an episode of our podcast, Words Like That. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, so there's not going to be a video version of that, but it is available audio only on the RSS feed, on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. I've thought about trying to put some trailers and clips together and put it on YouTube, but I don't think I'm going to have time to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about it, get something up on YouTube, talking about Dune Part 2. In short, it's great, okay? Very, very good film. I didn't think it was as good as one. Let's start off with the good, and there's a lot of good in this film. The acting, for the most part, was top tier. I think for me, Javier Bardem was the cherry on top. Every time I see Javier Bardem in a new role, he's just as good as the previous role I've seen him in, but the roles are completely different, and he's selling them equally well as well. Number two, I would say Rebecca Ferguson. Without getting into too much spoiler territory here, there's an event that happens early in the film that completely alters her character. So she's essentially playing a completely different character in the rest of the movie than what she's played in the first few scenes and what she played in the first film. And she just absolutely nails it, which means that she's nailed both characters, because the original version of the character she was perfect in, and now the radically changed version, she just nails it. Timothée Chalamet, also excellent. Zendaya was great. In fact, it's really her movie. It's really Zendaya's character, Johnny. It's really Johnny's movie. And I thought that was an interesting choice, even whenever Paul, Timothée Chalamet's character, takes center stage, it's always from Shawnee's perspective. So I thought that was an interesting creative choice. And from my understanding, that wasn't really how the book played out, but it works here. Austin Butler, who I thought was excellent in Elvis, even though I didn't particularly care for that movie, is equally as good here as the sociopathic villain Fade. Stellan Skarsgård reprising his role from the previous film. Also excellent. You just hate his guts as this albino, evil gangster, Jabba the Hutt type character, even though I know the character in the book actually predated Jabba the Hutt and maybe actually inspired Jabba in the Star Wars series. I'm not sure if George Lucas has ever addressed that. But anyway, excellent job. A couple of weak points on the cast. Léa Seydoux wasn't in the movie for very long at all, didn't have much to work with. Also, Florence Pugh, who I absolutely love. I've talked about her multiple times. I think she is one of, if not the best actresses of her generation working today. The character was very subdued, not a lot there. Florence Pugh did fine with what she had, but again, wasn't that much to work with. So, fell a little flat for me. I was expecting something a little beefier, but they're setting it up for part 3, so maybe we'll get more of that in part 3, Dune Messiah. The big casting weakness, and I can't believe I'm saying this, Christopher Walken as the Emperor. And I love Christopher Walken, and I've seen him in serious roles, and he does a great job, and he sells it, and I believe him. This was not one of them. Every time he was on screen, I just could not take him seriously as the Emperor. It was just, all I could see was Christopher Walken. It was just, oh, Christopher Walken is there on the screen in Dune. Not, oh, there's the Emperor, he's doing an incredible job. In fact, I made this joke on the podcast that I expect him to say, I have a fever and the only prescription is more spice. You know, so that was the biggest miscast. I feel like they should have gone with somebody else, another heavyweight, heavy hitter of that age bracket would have been a better choice than Christopher Walken for this. The directing and cinematography were both great. I have nothing negative to say about that at all. Denis Villeneuve is just a master craftsman at the direction. And it's interesting because the first movie had all these very wide landscape shots, very Lawrence of Arabia-esque. I didn't feel that there were that many in this one. I felt like that some of the shots were a little tighter, a little closer on the actors as opposed to the big landscapes. Not that there weren't some big landscape shots, but I didn't feel like it was as prominent as the first one. I could be wrong there. It's been a while since I watched part one. But that being said, that just goes to show you that he doesn't have to just have these giant landscapes to make a beautiful movie, that he can focus on a little bit smaller scale in terms of his framing and still work. Just phenomenal from top to bottom. There was one scene in particular that was the introductory scene to Fade, the villain Austin Butler's character, that was shot with infrared cameras, which gave it this really beautiful black and white feel. Great directing, great cinematography. I'm not sure who the cinematographer was on this. I should have looked that up before I did this, but great job all the way around. There are sequences in this film that are so riveting, they demand to be seen on the big screen. And there's one sequence that was actually spoiled in the trailer. They actually used a good chunk of it in the trailer, and it's a scene, spoiler alert here, where Paul, Timothée Chalamet's character, rides a sandworm. And even though I had seen that in one of the trailers, it may have been in multiple trailers, can't remember now, it was not spoiled. It was like it was the first time I was seeing it on the big screen. It didn't matter that I had seen it before. It was just that riveting to be there, seeing it on the big screen with the surround sound. You were just immersed in it. My jaw literally slacked agape. Great sequence. That was the only one in the film. In terms of the narrative, I love the conflicting ideas of the reluctant chosen one, again, spoiler alert here, who finally embraces it and then goes nuclear to what for me was a satisfying conclusion. But it's interesting because the way it's played from Zendaya's perspective, from Chani's perspective, I should say, it's like we're not really supposed to want him to be the chosen one. Like we're supposed to prefer his reluctance, and after he decides to go through with it and beats the bad guys, we're supposed to kind of be like, well, is that the right choice? And I guess we're going to find out in Dune Messiah. To me, it was a really, really good hook there to leave it like he's accepted. It seems like the right choice. He has the ability to see in the future and know all of the possible futures, and he's taken the path. I think he may have said the only path, or may have said there were a few paths he could take where things turned out well. So he knows what path to take for everything to turn out the best, yet it ends with Chani's character, who we're supposed to be seeing the movie through, really sad and disappointed that he's done it, and that kind of foreshadows like maybe it's not going to all turn out great. So I'm curious to see how that's going to pan out in the third movie. The weak points, other than some of the casting choices. The third act was just as good, if not better, than anything in the first movie for me, but that wasn't the case with the first two acts of the movie. Even though Act 1 was much more fast-paced and action-packed than the first half of Part 1, Act 1 of Part 2, I should say, was more action-packed, fast-paced the first half of Part 1. It was less engaging, and I didn't care as much about the stories or characters as I did watching the first movie. Even though I now know both the characters and the story better than I did going into Part 1, I still didn't care as much this time around as I did the first time. Act 2 slowed down even more, and I found myself even less engaged, even though Act 2 was dedicated to the introduction of Austin Butler's villain, who was great. And again, you had this introductory fight scene that was shot with infrared cameras, but even that sequence ran on too long. And it felt like virtually every sequence in the first two acts could have been trimmed slightly for pacing. Yet, there were other times where there were these large jumps in time and space that occurred without a visual cue that the jump was taking place or about to take place, which is fine for savvy viewers who are paying attention and really following the movie, the story, but even for those of us who are, it takes a moment to realize what's happened, and you're kind of jarred and taken out of the movie for just a brief period while you're trying to piece together from what you're seeing and hearing exactly what's transpired off screen, and that we're now in a totally different place, or that we're now in a totally different time. So I think on occasion, just a couple of short bridge shots to cue the audience in that we're about to make a jump in the narrative to prevent such a jarring change of pace and breaking the flow of viewing, if not the flow of narrative, would have been in order in those particular things. But it's kind of nitpicky because the movie was really well done, but I just think a few of those little things here and there would have really tightened it up and put it more in the bracket of Part 1, which, again, I felt like was a better film. Overall, great film. I'm leaning an 8 out of 10, but the more I think about it, I might end up bumping that up a bit. And if I had the time, I would go see it again in theaters. And I highly recommend, if you were a fan of the first one, to go see this movie. And if you want to hear a more in-depth discussion of this, go listen to our latest episode of the Words Like That podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Consider supporting us on Patreon, and we'll see you soon.